just saw the World Economic Forum wrap up in Davos. It's a topic very much on the mind of people. No doubt there's definitely exerting an influence globally, whether that be against energy sectors, whether that be against freedoms, rewriting our constitutions. What is your position on the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab, the Great Reset?
I am not a global young leader of the future identified by World Economic Forum. I would say that my philosophy would be entirely opposite of what they propose. And when I was on the air, I did a number of segments about the World Economic Forum, and I think a lot of people kind of thought, who is this weird guy who puts together these conferences? Should we take him seriously? And I think he was a bit of a joke initially, and maybe he wasn't taken seriously, but we should take him deadly seriously.
Yeah.
He's got the billionaires, wealth creators, government officials, and he brags about the influence that he has.
Yeah.
And what is he trying to do? He's trying to bring in Chinese-style stakeholder capitalism, which is essentially using all of the levers of the private sector in aid of the state and government goals. And when you start doing that, you don't have free enterprise anymore, because what you've done is you've essentially created a crony capitalist regime. Yeah. And when you have a crony capitalist regime where the only way that you're able to start a company or innovate is when some bureaucrat tells you can, and you can be regulated out of business because someone has a better connection with government than you do, that is the exact opposite of what we are in Alberta, and we've got to be fighting against it.
People are losing their jobs, and there's families and livelihood.
So Adam Soos here for Rebel News, and I am joined by Danielle Smith, UCP leadership hopeful. You've invited us out here to High River, very much home for you. Before we get into some of the politics and nitty gritty, tell us a little bit about High River.
All right, well, you're missing some really interesting sites. This is one of our most interesting streets in High River. Yeah. We've got an old vaudeville theater, so it was converted. So it's from the 1920s, I believe. So it was converted into a movie theater, and Sid runs it. With his family. It has some of the best movies, actually. He does a really good job of being able to gather. I haven't been able to be in since the restrictions ended, but we used to have a partnership with Sid and our railway dining car, which is, David and I bought this in 2017. It's been in the town since 1993. Yeah. And it was initially a CN passenger car that got converted into a dining car in 1965 to be able to support the expo. Yeah. And then brought here in 1989. It's been operating as a diner ever since. Needed a heck of a lot of repair work, which we did. And just when we were ready to go, the restriction and exemption program came into place and all the opening and closing. So it's been, I've been kind of on the front line of having to deal with all of the rules and restrictions, conflicting messaging that we've been getting over the last couple of years. But we've turned it into a little bit of an attraction in town.
That's awesome.
And then here's the upside of COVID is that a lot of people started exploring the rest of the community and coming out, doing little day trips. And so we have actually done so well with the generosity of Calgarians and others who have visited over the last couple of years. So we're just kicking off into the summer season with that. Yeah. This is the station. When we used to have the train coming through here, it only actually, I think, got decommissioned and the line taken out in the few years prior to us coming. So we used to have grain elevators along there. The last one burnt down, sadly. But this is the old station that used to have the train come through here, and they've turned it into a museum. My husband sat on the museum board when we first came to town. And so he knows a little bit more, a lot about the town. They've got a really great display in there for Heartland, because High River is the home of Heartland, which has been shot here for, I think they're on their 15th or 16th season. And it's always super fun because they've got a place in the back where the CP lands used to be that they've pulled out, and that's where the circus goes whenever we have movies. We did actually have Last of Us filmed in here. Wow. We also had a zombie movie that was filmed in the rail car as well, which was, I'm glad people didn't see that because it was after the zombies went through and there was blood spatter and grossness everywhere, but they did a great job cleaning it up. But it's a fun town, and we've got some beautiful architecture. Yeah. And these are some of the two most interesting streets with cafes and Yeah, it's our murals. It's just a beautiful place to be.
It's so small town Alberta. It's very sort of iconic. And on that note, as we turn onto a different road, maybe we can get into this leadership conversation, get into the politics of it a little bit. One of the sort of elephants in the room, one of the things that people often bring up, and I know you addressed it right away in your sort of announcement in that first press conference, is the sort of floor crossing. So it's something you've sort of said you regretted or you approached it maybe naively in the past. If you could go back to 2014, you're in charge of the Wild Rose Party, what would you do differently now?
It was very clearly a mistake. I think what I should have done is that I should have done the same kind of job as opposition leader that I had done with the two prior leaders, and just made Jim prove to us that he was going to be a different type of leader. Because ultimately, he wasn't able to prove that. And we ended up with both parties being shattered and the NDP forming government for 4 years. So I think that the political climate now has changed. And one of the worries that I had back then was that we weren't getting the breakthrough with Wild Rose, and we were pulling support away from the Conservatives. I was increasingly worried that we were going to see a progressive party win. It wasn't clear what it was going to be at that time, but I think it's clear today that the NDP have managed to consolidate the left-wing vote, and there's no real competitor on the left now that is going to be able to pull that away from them. And so if we end up seeing the Conservative vote split with multiple different parties, multiple different leaders, then I think we will end up with another NDP government. That's part of the reason why coming back into politics, it was important for me to come back in to the mainstream party, the United Conservative Party, because I think that when I went to the AGM, it was pretty clear to me that the merger between the two Wild Rose and PC cultures have been successful, but I think that the leadership has been part of the problem, and so now we have a chance to address that.
Well, the polling certainly speaks to that, the party doing better than the leadership, and in fact, we've actually seen a bit of a jump in the popularity of the party after Kenny resigned. Do you think Albertans are ready to sort of look past that, kind of forgive on that floor crossing front and get moving forward with the politics that you want to advocate for?
I think that one of the things that happens in this province is I don't think we expect people to be perfect. We know people make mistakes, and we have to, as long as I've been very clear about the mistake that I made and how I would have approached it differently. And all I can do is now sort of, as I said, I didn't run away. As soon as I got fired from politics by my constituents, the members of the party decided they didn't want me to be their candidate. I found another way to have a meaningful role in Alberta politics, which was on radio for 6 years.
Great.
In some ways, I wish I'd been able to be on talk radio first, because you get that immediate interaction with the audience, so that they will tell you immediately if you've got something wrong, or if they don't believe your perspective, or if they want to offer a counter opinion. And it's such an important dialogue to have, and I would love for that to continue in politics, because sometimes you get what they call dome disease, where you're surrounded by staff and people who all see things the same way. The only real way that you can find out what Albertans want is to get out there, do town halls, and meet with them. And so I'm still going to continue on doing my. I have a regular live stream that I do each week, and I'm going to have the Danielle Smith show branded a little bit differently, but I'll do that on a weekly basis so I can interview people. Because if I have to interview people to find out what their issues are, what their policies are, I may as well do that anyway and share that with the public.
Right.
So I think that there's also a tradition in this province of having leaders who have been radio broadcasters. We had Ernest Manning and William Aberhart. Look at the current premier. He also has now a weekly show on radio. So to me, podcasting is such an exciting and dynamic way of talking with people, and so I'm going to continue on with that tradition. So there you go. You got the scoop. I haven't started that yet.
Awesome. There we go. Breaking news for everyone out there. It's very interesting. You sort of talked about that dome disease or that echo chamber that people can get trapped in. Do you think that might have contributed to Jason Kenney's downfall? And sort of what do you think his biggest mistake was?
100%. And it happens with every new leader, is that what happens is that because you have a life that you do prior to politics, and you've got a cell phone and you've got emails, the first thing staff will say is, oh, we need to change your phone number. You've got too many people who have it. Don't you worry. We'll let you know the calls that come through that are important. And then they say, oh, no, we need to get you a brand new email. You've got way too many people getting in touch with you. And that's part of the problem, is that there's a tendency to protect the leader, because you get a lot of negativity in politics. And I understand it comes from a good place, but in the end, if you're only getting feedback from 3 or 4 people, you're not going to have the wide range of views that you need to have. So as much as people may still be angry at me for what happened in 2014, the nice part is that I've been through this before.
Right.
So I know what you need to do to make sure that your MLAs feel valued and respected. I know what you need to do to make sure that you're addressing issues in individual ridings. I know what you need to do if you don't have an MLA representing that riding, how to reach out to the constituencies so that you can make sure that that the issues in those ridings are being respected. I have interviewed probably everyone in Alberta who has a policy issue that intersects with government that they need some solution on. And so I've got also just that ability to talk directly with the people. I've got 15,000 people who follow me on my newsletter. They give me direct feedback. I get to hear it. And I think that that's kind of what you need to do. And unfortunately, I think the Premier didn't continue to keep those relationships going. And part of it was COVID, that with all the restrictions, you couldn't go to as many meetings, you couldn't do town halls, you couldn't have that interactivity. But I think that's going to be key to make sure that we rebuild that trust in the party.
For many people, it was in fact the COVID restrictions and sort of the failings on that front that they deemed to be the reason Kenny is no longer around. Would you agree with that sentiment?
I think that's part of it. I look at it as being 3 parts. Oh, I should mention to you this as well. This is Carlson's. But they have been operating it for years as a music bar. They were particularly hit by COVID because we weren't able to have music venues for a lot longer than others. But they have this outdoor piano that everybody can go by and just feel free to use. And I should mention this too. I'm on a board of this charity, Wild Rose Community Connections. We started off doing parenting support for at-risk families, and we ended up losing 2/3 of our funding 2 weeks after COVID restrictions were announced. So we ended up having to retool, repurpose, and we got into the food security area because we knew that with this being such an old town, that we had a lot of seniors who were going to be coming back from being a snowbird and needing to get groceries delivered. So we've been doing a lot of that work over the last 2 years, and it's just such a delight to be involved in it. But so I've seen a couple of sides of COVID because of the restaurant, because of the work that I was doing with Wild Rose. The concern I really have is that we know that there's a certain level of domestic violence that occurs, alcoholism, drug addiction, and some of that is not getting reported because we didn't have that sort of safe second place in schools and other outside help. And so I'm worried that we're going to see a real surge in reporting on some of those issues. So those are things that we're going to have to deal with. But to your point, yes, it was absolutely. Oh, one more thing I have to tell you, Maggie's Diner. It's like everybody comes to town thinking that they're going to have something at Maggie's Diner, but it actually is just a movie set. So you can't go in there. You're going to have to go to one of the other restaurants in town. All of this area, actually, it's very funny because sometimes residents will come by and say, "Oh, look, there's a brand new place opening up," and then we go and we see actually it's just a new movie that's in town filming, and they've changed the storefront out. Wow. In any case. So I think definitely COVID restrictions were one of the problems. And I thought the Premier did a reasonably good job up until September of last year, because after spending a year and a half saying that vaccine passports, vaccine mandates were offside with the law, violation of our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, to do a complete 180 without even really explaining why. And when it came down to it, as we're hearing in court testimony, it was just to be punitive. It was just to make life difficult for people, to encourage them to get vaccinated. And that's not a good enough public policy or public health reason. So I think that was the final breach of trust. And people are now fearful, we're fearful, that we would go right back into restrictions in the next respiratory virus season. So there needed to be a change so that we can have the conversation that we will never have lockdowns again, that we will when respiratory virus season hits, as it always does, we have to find a better way to protect our most vulnerable in long-term care facilities, make sure that we've got early treatment options available to try to reduce the amount of hospitalization. We can protect people, but we have to do it in a different way.
Right.
We can't sacrifice kids
Yeah.
any longer. We cannot put those kind of restrictions on kids who really were the least impacted and the least at risk.
Yeah.
So I think we now are beginning to understand that. And I think there's going to be a bit of a public communication that has to be done around that, because people have been living in fear and with a bombardment of one-sided messaging for so long.
Yeah.
But I think if we can get that balance back, we'll be able to move forward on it. But that's not the only problem, actually, because I think now that we've seen that we were the first to reduce restrictions, I think people are now looking at some of the other things that have been on the back burner.
Yeah.
Like, where's the action now that we have a mandate to end equalization? Where's our strategy paper that we're going to put forward to the government in 2024
Yeah.
about how we want to end that program? Where is the Fairness Alberta agenda, where we're talking about collecting our own personal income taxes, which I think we can move on immediately? Where's the public campaign to try to talk about why we need our own provincial police force and our own pension plan, our own employment insurance? Those are the things that I think that are, if we look at where the division on the right is now,
Yeah.
it's almost all the groups that are trying to find some way to assert our autonomy in Canada, whether
Right.
it's All Hinman's party, or whether it was Drew Barnes' work, or
Mhm.
whether it's the Alberta Prosperity Project. If we want to keep the United Conservative Movement united, we've got to take some action on that. And it
Right.
can't be lip service. It
Yeah.
can't be, okay, I'll become leader, and then we'll get into the election, and we'll do something after the election. No one will
Yeah.
believe that. We've actually got to have some serious policy that we'll put in place in October when we get back into session. And the first thing I'd want to do is pass the Alberta Sovereignty Act that's being proposed by Rob Anderson and the Free Alberta Strategy. And that would essentially be like call it a keep off the grass policy.
Yeah.
It's a stay in your own lane Ottawa policy, like a notwithstanding clause. If they pass legislation that interferes in our areas of jurisdiction, we're not going to enforce it.
Yeah.
And Quebec does that. Saskatchewan is talking about asserting its own autonomy.
Yeah.
That's what people expect to see of us, and that's what we've got to get started on.
We will move on a little bit from this, but I just want to say that would also very likely tie in. Obviously, lots of pressure from the federal government did contribute to the provincial response on COVID-19. I just really quickly wanted to wrap some things up on that and then move forward to some other stuff. But so if elected premier, would you be willing to commit or say that there would never be a vaccine mandate?
Never a vaccine mandate.
Never ever, period.
No, because we have to make sure that that people have. Look, I've never made any secret of the fact that I'm pro-choice, but to me, pro-choice means across the board that if you believe in bodily autonomy, you can't force somebody to take a medical procedure that they don't want.
Yeah.
So it was never legitimate for us to have vaccine mandates, vaccine passports. It was never legitimate for Alberta Health Services to fire employees because they were unvaccinated. In fact, where we are today with now that we've had Delta and Omicron 1 and Omicron 2 and various other variants, most people I know who are unvaccinated because they already feel like they've got a strong enough natural immunity because they've been infected once or more than once.
Yeah.
And so there are other jurisdictions around the world that recognized that an infection with COVID was also allowed for immunity, and they allowed for people to have to travel freely without restrictions. So we could have taken a different track, and we chose not to. And I think, and we have to be very, very clear, we will not do this to people again. That's not who we are in Alberta. We don't create a second class of citizens, and we don't segregate. And so if we have to amend the Human Rights Act to make sure that people do not discriminate on the basis of a medical choice, then we will do that. I would hope that by demonstrating leadership at the provincial level, saying that we are not going to discriminate against our employees, that would send a signal to the rest of the private sector that they shouldn't either.
Right.
But that I think we've got to walk the talk first. We've got to make sure that we're not discriminating first.
So it's interesting. I wasn't really intending to go into this, but one of the sort of places where Jason Kenney, at least at the start, garnered some support was in that socially conservative sort of area. With you saying you're pro-choice, how do socially conservatives who are concerned about issues like abortion come into the fold if you're a premier?
Well, number one, I would never put pastors in jail.
Yeah.
That's something that those who value religious freedom should care about. It was a mistake, and it never should have happened. And I'm astonished that Alberta kept on doing it over and over again. I mean, I think I've seen your billboards.
Yeah.
Three pastors in Alberta. Why is it every other jurisdiction was able to get by without jailing pastors, and we were not? So that would be number one about someone who values liberty first, also values religious liberty as well.
Right.
Number two, a lot of I'm running in the riding of Livingston-McLeod, and we've got a large number of social conservatives down here who aren't taking the vaccine for religious reasons. And we've got to respect that. If you want a religious exemption, you should be able to get a religious exemption. And number three, I've talked to many of my social conservative friends that we've got to have a pro-family agenda. That why can't we talk about the things where we can all agree? Why don't we talk about how we can promote and support adoption so that we can have unwed mothers make a different choice, so that we can figure out how we can support families so that one parent can stay home, or we support more homeschooling options. If that's because it seems to me increasingly people are wanting to educate their own kids. To me, those are the things that are going to be really important in bringing the movement back together. Is let's talk in ways that put the family at the center of the fundamental building block of society and do whatever we can to support that.
Right.
And that to me is a unifying message. I don't want to talk about things we disagree on. I think we have so much more that we agree on. I've always felt that way.
Now, one of the sort of sentiments we're seeing that's become very popular, particularly looking at the federal leadership, is sort of jumping on this freedom bandwagon. Some people, for them, it may be very authentic. Other people might be trying to score political capital by being like, of course, I've always been in support of freedom and the truckers, and I've always been opposed to locking up pastors. How do you sort of address concerns that you might be sort of just capitalizing on that, and how do you sort of affirm yourself as someone who's always stood for those principles?
Well, I left my job in mainstream media because I didn't feel like I would be able to fully cover the story if I stayed in the mainstream media with the narrative that was being imposed. And the first thing I did when I left the air was to do a series of interviews that I wasn't allowed to do when I was on the air. I did interviews with doctors who were bringing forward an alternative perspective on how we should be treating COVID. I brought on another doctor to talk about various therapeutic options that would have been able to help save lives. I brought on the lawyers who were challenging the many of the restrictions in court. I brought on the politicians who were standing up and even getting fired from their jobs and fired from their caucuses. I also brought on Pastor Coates and his wife Erin to talk about the religious persecution. So for me, liberty, I call myself a libertarian, and I've been a libertarian for over 20 years. To me, the heart of that is liberty. It's been the most foundational, when I think of what everything I've done in public life has been about trying to find the proper role of government with respect to personal liberty. I was a property rights advocate. It's kind of central to who I am.
Right.
When the vaccine restrictions came in, my stepson is a tattoo artist, and he had just gotten a job promotion, and there was one symbol that I felt like if I ever got him to do a tattoo, it would be this symbol. And I'll show it to you because I did get him to do the. So what this is I went to a couple of seminars back in the 90s and 2000s with a group called the Liberty Fund. And they have a symbol that they found, which is the very first cuneiform rendition of the word liberty. And the story is in 2300 BC, Arukagina was leading a popular rebellion against the tyrants of the time. And the tyrants of the time were all administrators. There was a bureaucrat for fish, and a bureaucrat for boats, and a bureaucrat for sheep, and a bureaucrat for selling donkeys. And there was they had taxes on widows and orphans. If somebody came along and wanted to buy your property and had connections in government, you couldn't say no. And so Rukagina ended up sweeping that out and brought in a codified form to restore people's rights. And that symbol means return to the mother, which is return to the way things should be, which is sweeping away all of the gatekeepers and all of the sort of petty tyrants and authoritarians who want to interfere in your life. So that's how strongly I feel about freedom.
So two more questions. I'm sure we could talk about policy and stuff all day, but we just saw the World Economic Forum wrap up in Davos. It's a topic very much on the mind of people. No doubt there's definitely exerting an influence globally, whether that be against energy sectors, whether that be against freedoms, rewriting our constitutions. What is your position on the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab, the Great Reset?
I am not a global young leader of the future identified by World Economic Forum. I would say that my philosophy would be entirely opposite of what they propose. And when I was on the air, I did a number of segments about the World Economic Forum, and I think a lot of people kind of thought, who is this weird guy who puts together these conferences? Should we take him seriously? And I think he was a bit of a joke initially, and maybe he wasn't taken seriously, but we should take him deadly seriously.
Yeah.
He's got the billionaires, wealth creators, government officials, and he brags about the influence that he has. And what is he trying to do? He's trying to bring in Chinese-style stakeholder capitalism, which is essentially using all of the levers of the private sector in aid of the state and government goals. And when you start doing that, you don't have free enterprise anymore, because what you've done is you've essentially created a crony capitalist regime. And when you have a crony capitalist regime where the only way that you're able to start a company or innovate is when some bureaucrat tells you you can, and you can be regulated out of business because someone has a better connection with government than you do, that is the exact opposite of what we are in Alberta, and we've got to be fighting against it. So I would call myself the very opposite of the ideology of the World Economic Forum. And I admit I didn't take him seriously, because if you see some of the get-ups that he dresses in,
It's a bit of a caricature.
I mean, if you've seen the one on the beach, you cannot unsee that. And so when you look at that and think, how can this person be so influential?
Yeah.
It's actually quite scary how influential he's become.
Yeah.
In fact, I thought that one of the other alt-media outlets, Andrew Lawton at True North, did a really good job of sort of juxtaposing what the mainstream media says is, oh, don't take these guys seriously, with them saying, yeah, actually, we really do want to be able to track how much carbon dioxide you're emitting and be able to give that, who knows how they're going to use that information. And then there was another hilarious video where one of the presenters asked how many people in the room had an electric car, and only 4 people put up their hands. Meanwhile, they're flying in with their private planes and their limousines, basically having a conference to tell us how the rest of us should live. So I would say that everything we can do to push back against international intrusion into our affairs, we must do. Because that's the real problem that we have right now, is that there's this tendency towards centralization. International bodies want to interfere in what we do in Canada. Canada wants to interfere in what we're doing in Alberta. And even Alberta interferes in what we're doing at our municipalities. If we're going to stop equalization, we should really stop it at the municipal level first, and then we can have more credibility to fight it at those other levels. But we got to fight it.
And finally, how would you take on Rachel Notley and the NDP if you were the Premier?
I was in the legislature at the same time as Rachel Notley, and I think we have pretty different ideas about what we need to do for this province. I have a lot of trust in the individual. I have a lot of trust in families and communities and local governments, and so I would have a tendency to decentralize. I think that she's demonstrated, because she believes in big government solutions, that she would have a tendency to centralize because of how Justin Trudeau invaded our jurisdiction. That happened under her watch.
Right.
The cancellation of pipelines happened under her watch, and I just don't feel that she was a strong enough voice against Ottawa, and I don't think she will be. And that's going to be the number one battle that we have to fight right now. We also have to find better ways to support our families. I like the idea of health spending accounts so that we can give some money directly to people so that they can take care of the issues that they're having. I mean, we've got a lot of things that are not covered by our healthcare system. Mental health, counseling, nutrition services, chiropractic, physiotherapy. Let's give people the ability to start looking at paying for those things that are going to enhance their health. Also with our kids, we have so many kids that have fallen behind in the last 2 years in the K-3 area, kids who aren't reading at grade level, kids who might have speech problems and didn't get diagnosed early, so they've fallen behind their peers. We've got kids who are suffering a ton of anguish because they're not not being able to participate in activities.
Yeah.
They're also falling behind in math. If we can give this is an idea that comes from the UK, if we can just give a little bit of a bond to each student so that the parents can address whatever it is their kids' learning needs are, I think those are the kinds of solutions that we would bring as conservatives who believe in individual autonomy, competition and choice, and that government does not always know best. The individual knows best. That, I think, would be the biggest difference between us.
Yeah. And so do you believe, kind of a yes-no question here to wrap it up, do you believe that you can win the UCP leadership, and do you believe that you can defeat Rachel Notley?
Yes and yes, absolutely. I think we're not going to defeat Rachel Notley by just being by hiring better central planners, or by just being a better version of the NDP. And that's what I would say the biggest problem conservatives make, is that we do such a good job on the economy, on getting confidence back, on getting investment, on generating more revenues, and then we take that money and we give it to the people that the NDP hired. We have to give that money to local people, local jurisdictions, local municipalities, and it'll be spent so much better. Like, I'll give you an example. There's a family, community, and social supports is a department of every municipality, and it's jointly funded by the provincial and federal government. One of the ladies that I spoke with at one of them said, you know what, we lost a little bit of our funding, and if I could just get that $30,000 back, I'd be able to hire a part-time counselor who could come in here and who could help give counseling services to our seniors and to our teenagers who are struggling with what they went through over the last 2 years.
Yeah.
We will get more value out of that than giving another $1 billion to Alberta Health Services. And that's the difference in taking an approach that honors the individual and honors the needs of individual communities and honors the work that people are doing in local communities versus thinking that just handing it to a centralized bureaucracy is going to solve all our problems. It just won't.
Well, Danielle, thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. For everyone out there, you can find all of our coverage of the UCP leadership race at ucpleadership.com. We're hoping to speak to anyone who's willing to step up to the plate, ask them some of these tough questions, and have some of these conversations that you no doubt want to hear. Thanks for taking some time to speak with me today. And for everyone at home, thanks so much for tuning in. For Rebel News, I'm Adam Soos. UCPleadership.com is the spot to go if you want to cover the latest on the race to see who will be the next leader of the United Conservative Party of Alberta. We're also wanting to extend an invitation to anyone out there who might decide that they are announcing a run to come join us for one of these interviews, have an opportunity to share your opinion and share your vision for Alberta moving forward.